fisheries biologist with the USGS Leetown Science Center in Kearneysville, West Virginia. He will discuss his research on population and community ecology in Appalachia. So Dr. Hitt, welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Autumn. Appreciate it. It's really good to be here. Can you guys hear me right now?
Yes.
Hear me? Okay, cool. Well, look, first off, I want to thank the Rivers Coalition for what you guys are doing. It's awesome work. I encourage everybody out there to support the Rivers Coalition. All right, you can go now. Bye. That's it. No. What we're doing today is we're going to talk about brook trout. And this is really cool, but let me, first some context, right? I know this is a really hard time for a lot of folks out there. I mean, it's not easy. A lot of parents out there are dealing with, having to be a homeschool teacher as well as all their other things. And there's, it's not easy. And in a way, it gives us, I don't even know what day it is. I don't even know what time it is. I mean, so there's that context, but then let's think about it this way. When we think about the ecology and the biology of these streams, it can also give us some perspective on time, okay? So we think, oh, the last 3 months has felt like forever. In some ways it has. But let's just step back for a second, okay? Brook trout has a story about deep evolutionary time, and we want to talk about that a little bit. So brook trout have been here for millions of years, okay? Not just a couple of months. They've been here for millions of years, and there's some stuff that we can learn about how the world works based on, their deep evolutionary history. Okay, so that's what we'll talk about today. I'll give you some context, a little bit about the ecology. But I understand that we have a diverse audience here, so I'm going to really try not to get too technical or jargony. Feel free to wave your hand or let me know if you've got a question as we go through here, and then we'll have some time for discussion. That's really what it's about, and I can learn stuff from you guys too. Let me first say, some background on me, where I'm coming from. I'm at the Leetown Science Center. I'm a fisheries biologist there. I do population and community ecology for freshwater fishes. I work on a whole bunch of stuff. Brook trout's a part of it. That's what we're going to focus on today. Okay. So I said there's a deep evolutionary history. Just let's do this as a warm up. Imagine that you're walking down to your favorite stream. Okay. But it's not today. It's not 2020. Roll the clock back hundreds of years, thousands of years, and in the Southern Appalachians, millions of years, because it's been millions of years since we've been glaciated in the Southern Appalachians, okay? Now, the Western mountains, I love the Rockies. I love those juvenile mountains. They're just infants. That's fine. They're beautiful and all, but they don't have the deep evolutionary history. West Virginia and the Eastern mountains do, and brook trout are a big part of that. So imagine you're walking to your favorite stream, but it's not this year, it's millions of years ago. Look around, what do you see? Well, a good thing to ask is, what do you not see? You look around, you wouldn't see birds, okay? We're talking about 400 million years ago. You wouldn't see birds, okay? You wouldn't even see flowering plants, okay? You would only see angiosperms and ferns, gymnosperms rather, and ferns. You wouldn't see flowering plants, but you would see fish in these streams, and you would see the evolutionary ancestor to brook trout. Brook trout have been here for millions of years, and that just should give us a little respect for their ability to survive. I think humans could really appreciate, especially now more than ever, what it takes to survive in the long haul. Okay, so these are really important species. There are a lot of people out here already know this, but let me just say that this is an extremely important ecological species. It has sort of a keystone role in some of these systems, okay, an important effect on other species. It's also an indicator of environmental quality. That's extremely important. And, it's economically and culturally very important too. I mean, there are industries that are based on, recreational tourism, and West Virginia really needs to mobilize on that, and there's always work to be done there. But that's the context that we're dealing with this. That's why people are so motivated to understand and to conserve native brook trout. This is what they need. This is what it comes down to: cold water, clean water, complex habitat. By complex habitat, what I mean is, structural complexity, like, woody debris and undercut banks in the streams, all that good stuff. And really what this translates to is forests. You have forests, you can have brook trout. If you don't have forests, you can't. Here's where they're distributed across the US. The eastern part is the native range, right? And the western part, they've been introduced. Now, this is really cool. There's a lot of life history diversity in the across the native range. If you look up to the top west in the Great Lakes, you have some populations that migrate into the lakes and out to the streams. Those are called coasters, really cool. Same kind of deal in the eastern US on the coast, where they're called salters. They're what people think of as anadromous, because they're going to be migrating out to the ocean and then migrating back into the streams to breed. So they can grow quite large there. Streams and rivers, lakes to the north, but in the southern Appalachians, what we're doing in our work, and where West Virginia is, of course, we're dealing with headwater streams. That's the name of the game for brook trout in the east, West Virginia. We also can see this as the context is very troubling. Look at the trends. So green, these are watersheds here across the Appalachians, and look, the trends are greatly reduced numbers of these fish. Okay, so there's work to be done there. So here's what I'd like to do today. I'm going to give you a framework, and I think this hopefully will be useful for any way that you want to deal with understanding climate change. Just as a general framework, this should work for any species or any system. A way to think about the main categories of climate change. And then we can think about brook trout. Where are we most and least confident, based on the work that's been done in our lab and in other labs. And then I'll talk about some ideas moving forward. I think there's an opportunity here, and I'll try to motivate this with some concluding remarks. That's what we're going to do. In our background here involves a whole bunch of different ways of collecting data and thinking about these systems. One of my favorite is the fieldwork component. These are beautiful systems. These are amazing places. Here's a stream in Shenandoah National Park. I mean, this is brook trout water. We also do a lot of work at the landscape level. So that red dot kind of just represents what you might see sort of at the human scale of observation. But we have to put this into a larger context. So we're thinking about spatial modeling or understanding the context of a particular place. It's kind of what we think of as landscape ecology. Also, I run an experimental stream lab at the Leetown Science Center where we can simulate in natural conditions, but control them and manipulate them in ways to learn things about brook trout response to temperature or competition or other sorts of stressors on the landscape. That's a lot of fun. Although at the moment we are shut down from that, that work is being postponed. We'll see where that goes. But stream lab work, I'll talk about some of that. And then some modeling and simulation work, some statistical analysis. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but this is basically where we take natural systems, and then we apply some really wild and largely untested assumptions, and then generate fantastical predictions about the future with some numbers associated. And then there's another dimension to this too, and I'll be concluding with a discussion about this today. This is where we think about open science, crowdsourcing, citizen science. I think the Rivers Coalition has a big role to play here, so I want to talk about that. So here's a way to think about the big picture, okay? The big picture for brook trout, or really I think any system, climate research. The first dimension is this. I'm going to build a Venn diagrams and some overlapping circles here, okay? The first dimension is exposure. This is what we call, when we use the term exposure, what we're thinking about is how environmental conditions will change, how habitat conditions will change, okay? Exposure, that's what we'll call that. Then this concept of sensitivity, which means basically, given those changes, how will populations and communities respond, okay? So we can think about different mechanisms that control sensitivity. And the third one, and the most, I think, the most work to be done is in this third realm is in terms of understanding adaptive capacity. In other words, how will evolution keep pace with these changes? Where will it not? And these are rapid changes. And in some cases, we shouldn't expect evolutionary change to keep pace. In other cases, maybe we could. So there's a really interesting zone of research. These are the three main fields of research. I'm going to talk about how they interact and what we've done on each of those. And of course, this is a lot more than my research lab. This is work that involves meteorology, hydrology, geophysics, and the exposure side. On the sensitivity side, these are population dynamics. Think about physiology, the way organisms consume oxygen, how they function at an organismal level. And then adaptive capacity, of course, here we're dealing with genomics, genetics, evolutionary ecology, okay? Deeper concepts in a sense. So let's start with the first one, exposure. Now, the temperature is the big thing. Here are some numbers that you need to know. 20 degrees C, 23 and 25. These are thresholds that brook trout respond to in terms of heat stress. 20 degrees C, if you have a brook trout exposed to water that's warmer than 20 degrees C, which is I think what, like 67 Fahrenheit, something like that, I might be wrong, but something like that, then they start expressing stress hormones, right? So cortisol and other sort of stress hormones get produced. You can tell they don't like it. It's not going to kill them instantaneously, but you get a temperature to 25 degrees C, that's a lethal temperature. All right, now we can also see that in the US, temperatures are heating up. That's not a question anymore. That's empirically what we see happening. You can look at the last fourth National Climate Assessment, but you can also see more recent data. Unfortunately, when we update this, when our European colleagues have updated their modeling here for January 2020, we see the same kind of anomaly. It's worth noting that the eastern U.S. is in January 2020 was showing anomalously high temperatures relative to other places, although you can see this general trend across Europe and other areas too. So that's the lay of the land. That's real. The key question, of course, for brook trout, is how does it affect water temperature? Air temperature change is one thing, but they've experienced water temperature change. Okay, so we know that stream temperatures and river temperatures are increasing in some places. Here's an example from the Potomac River. It's right by our place here in the Eastern Panhandle. And temperatures are going up. Now, that's in the big river, and big rivers are different because they assimilate a lot of small tributaries, right? So the big rivers have a lot of surface area. They assimilate air temperature more efficiently, but it's more complicated in streams, right? The assumption has always been that elevation drives stream temperature, right? The higher up you are, the colder you are, the colder the streams are. But what we're learning is that it's actually not that simple. Groundwater also is important, and it buffers stream temperature effects in these small catchments, in brook trout water in particular. And that's really important, okay? So we can't just rely on elevation to make predictions. We got to think about groundwater. In West Virginia, here's the elevation story. You've got the Appalachian Highlands. You've got the Monongahela National Forest, Otter Creek, Laurel Fork. These are Cranberry Wilderness. These are some of the best places on the planet, and I'm not biased at all. That is the absolute truth. So that's the elevation story. You have places like the Shavers Fork of the Cheat River. This is a super important high elevation watershed in West Virginia that supports brook trout. And here's what it looks like. But even in this large river system that is cold enough and high enough to support brook trout, there's an important role of groundwater. Groundwater is moving from terrestrial landscapes under the soil into the stream, and as it comes up, it provides habitat, which is extremely important for egg and larval development, right? Juveniles, because they're in the gravels as eggs and larvae. It's also really important for adult over summer survival. In other words, when it gets hot in the summer, there are patches of cold water that are resilient to air temperature change. Those are the last places where we predict that we will find these cold water fishes, okay? And anglers know this, right? Anglers know this, but the challenge from a research perspective is to be able to predict that to many, many places and to use that for conservation planning, okay? I should say as a parenthesis, the Supreme Court just ruled on a really important case relative to this. The Maui decision just came out. The Supreme Court just ruled that groundwater contamination can be and should be regulated under the Clean Water Act. So just file that away. It's an extremely important decision, and it relates to this mechanism in ecology. So we've developed some new techniques to be able to measure groundwater, okay? We can use very simple and pretty cheap temperature gauges that are deployed in stream, and we can observe temperature and then sort of use some statistical methods to back calculate or to infer the influence of groundwater. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but the main idea is that where stream temperature tracks air temperature closely, that's a sensitive site. That's where air temperature is going to translate into water temperature increases. On the other hand, the right side of the plot here, there are places where air temperature is, or water temperature rather, is invariant to air temperature. So you could have air temperature bouncing all up and down, water temperature steady. Those are spring creeks, and they tend to be more resilient. Still kind of open question over multiple, tens of years or longer. These are going to warm up too. but we predict that they'll be warming slower and they'll be more resilient for longer. We can also use some features of the landscape to predict these places. Here's an example from a map in Shenandoah National Park. You can see that there are some cold places. This map shows that points that are separated by 100 meters apart. And when we can predict groundwater influence, we can see that there are some spaces in there that are really important. And this is the kind of thing that the West Virginia Highlands Conservancy, Land Trusts, Trout Unlimited, all of the players that are working in this space can use, and the state and others in the national parks can use to say, aha, this is a special place. This is a place where we think there will be resiliency, thermal resiliency. We can use this, and our lab group has, to make some predictions about the future. Here's the URL if you want to check it out. But the main idea, here's an example. The main idea is that we expect thermal fragmentation, okay? These red circles show where sites become unsuitable, okay? And the main idea is it will not be a well-behaved process, okay? As air temperature increases, it's not just gonna march uphill, like just slowly, becoming warmer, warmer, warmer. No, that'll happen, but in addition to that, it's gonna become warmer at the top of these systems too. In this example, you can see that you start losing habitat all over the place, not just downstream. So we have to account for that. We also need to account for the fact that some of these streams naturally go subsurface. This is fragmentation. And as we see more extreme flows and more extreme summer rainfall events, including the drying, we'll see more of this. And that obviously has implications for brook trout. So that's all on the exposure side. Now let's flip over to the sensitivity side. We're looking at population responses, and just this is a plot that came out of a lot of modeling work, which I'm not going to go into, but I will summarize the main idea, which is that, so basically what we're looking at here on the y-axis going up and down here is the estimated number of fish. And then on the bottom plot, the x-axis is the year, so time, okay? Now, we simulated conditions in the winter. Now, the reason that this is important is because as winter flows go up, the number of juveniles the next year goes down. And this is because high flows, storm events, they are sort of scrubbing these streams in. They're flipping rocks over. They're crushing eggs and larvae. Because brook trout are spawning in the fall, their eggs and juveniles, larvae, are exposed and they're vulnerable over the winter, okay? Now that's, once in a while, a high winter flow is not a big deal. It's natural, right? And like I said first, these species has been here for millions and millions of years. They've seen it all. They've seen everything. I mean, they saw the clear cutting of the Appalachian forest at the turn of the century and rebounded. They have seen a lot. I mean, they've seen a lot. And once in a while, an extreme event, it's not going to affect the stability of these populations. See that in the top left. Extreme events are rare, you have stability. But when extreme events become common, you see extirpations. That's the bottom right-hand column, okay? If you get a high winter storm every year, you lose these populations, and that's because they can't persist. They're breeding at maybe the second or third year of life. And if you have a high storm event for several years back to back, that knocks them out. So that's something to watch for. And the other thing I'll say about this is that this parameter, this prediction about winter flows is the most confident prediction that the atmospheric scientists are giving us for the northeastern US. This is really one to watch. This is where there's high confidence from the meteorological atmospheric science, and there's high confidence from the biological community, okay? Winter storms, that's extremely important. The other thing we can think about in terms of sensitivity is sort of how introduced species interact with with brook trout. And that's some work we've done in the stream lab here. This is a photo kind of showing a groundwater test. We pump in cold water to create these thermal refuges, basically these thermal plumes that provide cold water. And then we can increase the ambient temperature. So we can ask questions about when do fish require cold water? When can they use anything? And also, how does it interact with other species in the mix? So this is brown trout and brook trout. The brown trout are native to Europe. Brown trout an important sport fish, you know, in the eastern U.S. and actually throughout all of the U.S. Important sport fish, not native. There's other trade-offs there. But what we learned is that brook trout actually do better they can handle warmer temperatures if brown trout are absent. That's kind of cool because we can't necessarily affect temperature, but we can potentially affect whether brown trout are present or not. And that can give native brook trout a chance to hang on. And I'll say also that we have an experiment in the real world going on with Maryland DNR right now. I really do respect what they're doing. It's really conservation-minded management in Maryland DNR. Also, I should give a shout out to the West Virginia DNR colleagues here. West Virginia DNR is doing top-notch work on this species. They're actually, and we'll get into this more with the adaptive capacity part, but they're actually trying to account for native genes, basically to conserve the genetic structure and the genetic history of these species as they try to reestablish new populations. That's really progressive work. Brandon Keplinger and others with West Virginia DNR, they deserve credit for that, and they need your support. So let's pivot to that third and final component here, adaptive capacity. This is really, I think, where there's most uncertainty and most opportunity for research. I'm going to tell you a quick little story about this. This is from some work we did in the Stream Lab across the state of Maryland. So in Western Maryland, there's a river system you might be familiar with. It's called the Savage River System. Fantastic fishery. It's, again, a sort of higher elevation, big river. So you get brook trout in larger water because it's higher elevation, it's colder. That generally works. There's also groundwater. Groundwater is an important part there. But then here's the part that blows my mind. If you go to the east, that is the Gunpowder River system. So these are, you know, occupied watersheds, the last place that brook trout are holding on. If you go to the Gunpowder River system to the east, this is in the Piedmont. This is fairly low elevation, okay? And there are still native brook trout there. Well, they've been hanging on there for at least tens of thousands of years, probably much longer than that. And we can understand why. Now, you know, millions of years of evolutionary history, tens of thousands of years is really nothing in that context. But it was about 35,000 years ago when the Wisconsin Age Glacier was parked right over PA and Ohio, okay? It didn't glaciate. It didn't get down here to scrub us down, but it's a big chunk of ice. So it refrigerated all of these rivers and streams. That's one thing that happened. The other thing that happened is because all that ice was locked up in glaciers, the sea levels were a lot lower. And think about what that does to the Atlantic coast. When the sea levels are lower, all of those rivers are now connected. They're connected miles and miles out from where the ocean currently hits. And so these are like epic, massive watersheds. The whole Atlantic coast of the US was formed in larger river systems. And that's how fish got from point A to point B, okay? Because they were connected when the ocean was lower, when the water was locked in glaciers. Now that glaciers are melting, air temperatures changing, sea levels are rising, but you know, these fish have seen it all. They've seen that come and go. So the point is, there are native brook trout in this population in eastern Maryland in the Piedmont. These are low elevation streams, and the main idea is that they've been exposed to different temperature for many generations. Okay, this is really cool because we see on the blue line here, these are the gunpowder sites. They get over 20 degrees Celsius regularly, okay? This is an example for a year. The sites to the west are in pink. They never get to that 20-degree threshold. Remember, I told you that 20 degrees is where you start seeing physiological stress, okay? So we brought fish from these different environments, and we brought them to the Stream Lab, and we used a common garden design. Basically, we acclimated these fish, and then we asked, do they do anything different? Are they functionally equivalent? Do they grow differently? Do they move differently, et cetera? And the answer is they are functionally different, okay? Different populations are shown here in different colors. The movement rate was really striking. So some fish just have different behaviors in the same environment. They're the same species. We had the same sex ratios. The size of these fish were the same, but they were performing very differently, which means that these places are special. That's what it means. That each place may be a unique genetic lineage, and that is worth conservation, in my opinion. So you can't just take fish from a hatchery in one place and just spread it everywhere and say, okay, we've done our job, that's back. No, it looks like there are differences that are really about the place where you find these fish. And I think that's an important theme too, because, you know, brook trout are not going to go extinct. All right, they're not. They're going to be here because, you know, they're all over the western U.S. They're in ponds. They're treated as a nuisance species out in the western U.S. And they're not going to go extinct in the near future. But what they might, and this is really the concern, and this is where the Rivers Coalition and other work going on in West Virginia really is so important, because it's really about the places. And my question and my concern is, you know, will these fish be extinct in their native range, in the places that we care about? Will we lose them from these places? They're gonna be around as a species. Okay. So anyway, here's what we've learned. They're functionally different, but I have to put a big asterisk on this, because these fish, it's possible that what we're seeing here is just long-term, you know, what we call acclimation effects, or it's, you know, what people refer to as phenotypic plasticity. Phenotypic means just the expression of genes. Plasticity means it's just, you know, it's variable. So that could explain this. To really nail this down, what we need to do is we need to breed fish in a laboratory environment and get the juveniles, okay, from those crosses, and then ask, are the juveniles that were raised in the same environment still performing differently or not? That's a next step. You know, stay tuned. That hasn't been done in the southern Appalachians. There's a little evidence to suggest that there is a genetic basis for these effects from work that's been done in Canada and elsewhere. So, you know, stay tuned. But I think the conservative assumption here is that places are different and therefore worthy of conservation because they are distinct. So let's just step back. This is what we've talked about. Here's a conceptual model: exposure, sensitivity, adaptive capacity. Where are we highly certain? Where are we uncertain? You know, I think there's most certainty here in terms of exposure. When we think about the big picture, we know that air temperatures are increasing. Landscape level changes are happening. Flow changes are happening. There's more uncertainty in the context of groundwater. There's still more work to do there. On the sensitivity side, you know, we can be highly certain about single year effects. Like if you show me the rainfall or the temperature for a year, I can make some predictions with that. But there's less certainty when we try to think about how multiple years interact. And again, to highlight a key point, look at winter flows. If we see back-to-back high winter flows, especially 4 or 5 high winters in a row, that's a possible problem. It's a real red flag. And then on the adaptive capacity part, we have low certainty there, but initial results suggest that these are special places. They're worthy of conservation, and that also bolsters what West Virginia DNR is doing, as well as some of the work on the Monongahela National Forest to recognize and to conserve these places because they're different and they're special, and they you know, require us to step up and protect these forests. Okay, so let me wrap it up with some thoughts about where we go from here. You know, I think, especially right now, science has been criticized for being sequestered, closed off, secret. You know, I think that criticism is largely unfounded. But if you think about the original motto of the founding societies of scientific enterprise back in the day, the motto was "See for yourself." Right? That was the first scientific rallying cry, if you will. It's that see for yourself. I mean, the king says that the world is flat. Okay, that's what the king says. I think we can all kind of relate to this now. The king says the world is flat. The scientists say, see for yourself. See for yourself. And I think that's really important because, you know, right now science is being criticized as being some sort of elitist enterprise. Well, maybe there's some justification for that criticism, but I think it's up to us to think about how to open that process. It's a process of learning, and there are some opportunities for that here. Okay, so let me talk about one of them. It's called Project eTrout, and this is a pilot project we put together recently. We took underwater video from a series of sites using this really inexpensive underwater camera And we can use that to estimate abundance of fish in different places, right? We're using that to try to understand climate effects. But in the process of doing that, we saw an opportunity to connect with people that are interested in engaging this. And we need people. Why? Because as I've said from the groundwater work, we can't simply use one observation in space. We need observations through many, many locations, right? And no single institution or organization, the Rivers Coalition or anyone, no single organization can do all of that. So we need to look to the public. And this is an opportunity for it with video technology that's becoming really cheap, really good. These are 4K images, and we can share these with the public to collect data about about fish abundance, and also to provide some educational opportunities. And it's fun. So for example, you can see a brook trout. You can see some diagnostic features. I mean, it's kind of grainy here, but you can see that white leading edge of the fin that identifies it to a species. You can also see there's an adipose fin, that fleshy little fin on the back. That tells you that it's a trout. I mean, so this is good enough to use. So what we did is we pitched this out to the nation. We said, okay, school kids, count these fish in different places, and developed a website with Virginia Tech. They did that, had a lot of counts, many locations, hundreds of individuals. It was really cool. You can check this out at usgs.gov/etrout if you'd like to. It's an opportunity. We've kind of closed the door for the formal process of there, but the website's still open. You can check it out. And one more thing I'll say is that I could imagine distributing these cameras to organizers or community groups for them to deploy in places they care about. And we could learn a lot from that. It's a really interesting opportunity. Everyone has these streams they care about. Well, we could now use imagery to collect data in a big way, and to provide analysis in a big way about many, many, many locations. So I think that's something to consider. You can email me, nhitt@usgs.gov for more info on that. Also, I'll mention some work that we've got going on right now. This is really exciting stuff. We're developing artificial intelligence technology and applying machine learning, basically, to identify individual fish from imagery. All right, well, that sounds like an interesting thing, but here's the part that has huge potential. If a photo of a fish can identify one fish from another, individuals, not just a species, but individual fish, then we can use that to estimate population size. And this is something that biologists have been doing for years and years. So you call a mark recapture study, where you collect a bunch of individuals, you put a tag on them, and you let them go. You go out and collect a bunch again, and the ratio of the number that you recapture on that second try, the number of marked fish to the number of unmarked fish, gives you an index of the total population size. Well, now we can do that with imagery. And I should say, this is getting out in front of my headlights a little bit, but we have some really encouraging preliminary results on this. And I can't go into detail, but I think it's going to work. I think it's going to work. Now, it's a little bit scary when you think about all of the, facial recognition technology everywhere. Well, we're calling this facial recognition technology, okay? And I think it's going to work. So think about this. Anglers, natural history enthusiasts, anyone. So, you're out there, you're fishing on a river, you catch a fish, boom, you take your photo, and then you can put it up on a website. And then that photo allows biologists to estimate population size. You're in the process, right? And then it also builds engagement with the public. So I really am interested in this, and I think it's technologically, I think we're really close, and we see encouraging preliminary results. I'll just leave it at that. Let me pivot it over to this. Just to give you a sense for what this looks like. So we're underwater. We're in a stream in the Shenandoah National Park, and you can see that users here, this is on YouTube, this is not great. They crush the resolution, but this is the idea. You can see some fish in the middle. You can also kind of you can swim around, right? Check out different habitat features. And this is from these 360 cameras that we deployed, And we're not seeing the video.
Yeah, we're not seeing it.
Oh, well, trust me, it is awesome.
We can hear it. It sounds really cool.
Trust me, it is really cool. So Let's see here.
Dan, are you able to put the link in the chat box for us?
Yeah, they could do that. Yep.
Sure, I think.
Let me do that. Let's see here. So that's what I wanted to present to you today. And let me just conclude by saying that this is a real thumbnail sketch of a whole lot of stuff. And there's a lot more to talk about and to dig into on all of this. I'd be interested in your thoughts and questions. You have my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. And thanks for your time.
Well, thank you so much for that informative presentation. If you have any questions for Than, you can enter them into the chat box. There's also a feature where you can raise your hand. If you click on participants and look at the participant list, and then there's like a little elliptical 3 dots, and you click on that and you can raise your hand that way. So we are interested in a discussion following this great information. So please enter any questions you have in the chat or raise your hand. So we do have one question. Where can this be viewed later? I see it as being recorded. Yes. So we will have the recording on our website, wvrivers.org. And if you had registered for this meeting, we can also email it out to the list of attendees. Let's see. This isn't really a question, but just informative. Mike Powell says, I appreciate seeing the thermal habitat forecast website. The Nature Conservancy has developed terrestrial resiliency land mapping tool with a link to it.
Yeah, I appreciate that work too. And I would say that it's important work. There's still, work to be done on this question of groundwater. And I think a lot of people know this intuitively. It's challenging to predict it, but that's something that the TNC tool, there's also a freshwater resiliency tool they produced, and I really do appreciate their work on this. But that was done at the watershed level, and there's, frankly, there's still work to be done at the site level. By that I mean, like, 100. Show me a prediction for 100 meters of stream out there. And that's the scale at which people are making these decisions. I mean, that's the scale at which people are putting in, riparian conservation measures where, you're making planning decisions. So we need granular information, and that's, it's not easy. Now, that said, I don't want to let the details overwhelm the main signal. Okay. We can, and I'm really good at getting lost in the details because I'm a scientist and you all understand that. But the main signal is this, that if you have a watershed that loses its forest cover, you lose your brook trout. And we know that clearly. The threshold for that, it depends, different places, but that's the main thing. The Forest Service, we've demonstrated this time and time again. So this is one of these things that, as an indicator, it's a state fish for West Virginia. It's also the state fish from Virginia and PA, so it's an iconic species, and for a good reason. But I think that, we really have to be, we can't take it for granted. That's what I think. So, other question. I see there's some kids on the line. I want to know what these kids are thinking about.
One question we have from Rick. Let's see, where was that? Have you looked at streams that historically had brookies but don't now?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, that work has been done mostly in like a modeling context. One of those first maps I showed with the green areas and the yellow areas, and that's really what that's where that has been tested. And there are a couple of signals, right? And I bet you guys can guess the predictors for what knocks out brook trout. It's fine silts, sediments. right? And the reason is, and actually I should mention, there's some really new work on this. It's kind of cool, but it's because you bury the eggs, right? These are super vulnerable. It's part of the life stage of the species where it makes it super vulnerable. The eggs can't run away, right? They can't take shelter. They're exposed to whatever hits them. And if you put sediment on there, it buries them. But here's some new work that has been, I think, informative and kind of challenging. It looks like that it's not just burying eggs that kills them. So around every egg is a very small boundary layer, a very small, like we're talking about, micrometer layer, just a thin little layer of skin around those eggs. It turns out that when you put sediment on eggs, the microbes that consume carbon from the or organic matter from the sediment, they're eating up oxygen in that process, and that starves the eggs. So it really looks like the mechanism is microbial respiration. In other words, consumption of oxygen around the eggs in a very, very small space. That's probably what ends up killing them. But one mechanism or another, the main thing is that if you put sediment or dirt in these eggs, it knocks them out. So that's one. Also, temperature, of course, is a big one. And there's some controversy about road salt. I mean, in urban areas, you lose brook trout, right? We've seen that. You've seen it in Maryland. You put pavement in a watershed, you get over about 2% of a watershed in pavement, then you lose your brook trout. And so there's some uncertainty about exactly what the mechanisms are, because if you put pavement in, a whole bunch of things happen at once, right? You get flashier flows, right? You're shooting off water, and that can knock out eggs and such. You're also increasing sediment. You're also increasing temperature. You're also changing water quality. You know how it is. It's ecology. So all these things tend to be happening at once. But the water quality part on road salts is interesting, and it's not fully understood because, just intuitively, if you add a whole bunch of salt to a system, these are not saltwater fish, except for like I said, there's some populations that will migrate to the ocean in New England. They're hanging on by a thread, right? But in general, these are not saltwater fish. But we do see that there's a chloride, so sodium chloride salt. That chloride effect is there's a threshold that harms them. But at lower levels, chloride is used to reduce their stress. Like when we're out there electrofishing, when we're using backpack electrofishers or whatever to collect fish from a stream, we put them in a bucket and then we're counting them or taking fin clips or whatever and letting them go. We put salt in these buckets because chloride actually has a calming effect at low doses. So, it's not totally clear to me that chloride is the killer. That's sort of a tangent. I mean, we know that impervious surface knocks these fish out, and that's the main thing. But there's still work to do to understand the physiology, and that's important, and all the mechanisms. So, hey, it's science. That work goes on, right? It's evolving. But
acid deposition.
Acid deposition, that's really cool. They are actually acid tolerant more than other fish. Now, acid deposition, what kills them is when you have a storm event. If you have a stream system that is unbuffered, so there's not much limestone in the watershed, you can have atmospheric deposition of, from coal-fired power plants largely, and that'll accumulate in soils. But here's the mechanism. When pHs of 5, so if 7 is neutral, 5, et cetera, is acidic, they can withstand pHs of 5. They'll actually be pretty tough. They'll be the last species standing. Acid will knock out other species before it knocks out brook trout. But what does kill them is when you have a high storm event in that flushes acidity through a system, and that activates the aluminum. And the aluminum is what kills them. So it's not acid per se, but it's how acid affects aluminum that kills them. And for sure, that's something you see it in the Blue Ridge, you know how it is, places that are unbuffered. And so that's a big concern. I should say hats off to the Park Service, because in places like the Smokies, they've pointed out that, look, if we have coal-fired air pollution putting nitrogen and sulfur, mostly the sulfuric stuff, into our streams that's acidifying these streams. The Park Service actually stood up and said, that's a water quality violation, and that's a threat to this resource. And that was the right decision. So I'd say acid is a concern. It's a concern in some places more than other places. And really, the mechanism is aluminum that causes mortality. Yeah.
We have a few more questions. Are there any cameras in local rivers around Jefferson and Berkeley counties?
Oh, cool. Yeah, we are doing work in this area, but we're not using cameras. And we could do that. Brook trout have been largely extirpated from the Eastern Panhandle. People are interested here in reintroducing the Freshwater Institute, and others have done a lot of great work trying to reestablish brook trout where they were native here in spring creeks. These are, like I talked about, groundwater is the important part. Groundwater is the key. And, brook trout have been extirpated here. It's something that we have some habitat quality challenges, to put it nicely. And so, we need cold water, which we have from this groundwater source, from these groundwater sources here. But we need more than that. Anyway, are we using cameras? No, because this isn't really brook trout water, but I will mention some work that we have going on that I think is going to be really important for West Virginia, streams and rivers, because there's an undescribed species of sculpin. A sculpin is a bottom-dwelling fish. It's associated with these cold rivers. It's really part of our natural history. It's really cool too. It's undescribed. In other words, fish nerds like me have always known, that there's, that this is something that we recognize, but it's not formally described. And so we're starting to actually do that formal description. And I think what this could lead to is conservation action, because it allows us to see that this is a global endemic. By that, I mean, the only place on the earth this species occurs is in the handful of streams in the Eastern Panhandle and in Maryland that feed these groundwater streams in the Potomac River Valley. So that's really special. I mean, it puts this region on the map for species diversity that I think is really cool. So we have that work going on. It's a good question, though, for cameras. And one of the things we've contemplated, and we have some pilot projects coming up here, and maybe folks on the line would be interested in jumping in on this, because we can distribute these cameras. They cost about $300 a piece. We can have little tripods. It's very user friendly. You plug it in to charge it. You push one button to turn it on. You push one button to turn it off. Forest Service is using this method for some of their work. And it's really hard to sample. You know how it is. These streams with lots of woody debris. I mean, streams in good condition will have a lot of complex habitat. You can't really effectively sample that with electricity or, angling. I mean, it's like any angler knows, that's, if you're not busting off flies, you're not fishing in the right places, right? So it's that complex habitat. So we can distribute these cameras to nonprofits, and Trout Unlimited has expressed interest in this. I would love to see school kids. There's a Trout Unlimited Trout in the Classroom program, and they were really actually essential for that Project E-Trout that I mentioned. They really stepped up, and now I think we're in a situation where people are trying to be more creative about what we can do online, as you all are, and I do appreciate that. And this is one of those ways. Now, that said, it's part of a larger trend, which is kind of, I mean, it's sort of strange in a way to think about. We're digitizing the world. We can't forget that these are real places, right? That we care about these places. We don't care about the digital representation of these places. We care about the places because they're precious. And, I think we can share that. I think we can share that in better ways. So these cameras are one way to share that. Another idea I'll throw out at you is, if people are familiar with Google Street View, right? Google Street, you can grab that little icon on a Google map and drop it down, and all of a sudden then you can see from the perspective, from the land perspective. What we're hoping to do is to develop Google Stream View. okay? Instead of the streets, let's look at the streams. And so you can navigate down into these mountain streams and, kind of explore them online in 360 imagery. That doesn't replace going outside. It doesn't replace being there, but it can open some minds to it. I think that's the key idea. For Project eTrout, I would love to take school kids from Harlem and the Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn all out to Shenandoah National Park, but I couldn't. Of course, I couldn't do that. But they did participate in this online education, and they were engaged. I thought that was cool because maybe we can spark something with this, a love of these places or a curiosity about these places, and that, of course, is a good thing. The digital rendition is just a teaser. It's just a way to communicate. It doesn't replace it. So we see opportunity there. The AI component is really neat. It's moving fast. We see potential. And then the citizen science and open science part as well. So think about places that might be special to you, or places that, streams that you love, or places you have questions about. And imagine what it would be like if we could have eyes in the streams integrated across hundreds of places. I think that's amazing. And I also think it would be a very interesting counterpoint or perspective to apply to what DEP is thinking about in the context of clean water and Clean Water Act, and the relevance there, I think, it could be explored. And it would put the power in the hands of people that are generated. It would open that scientific process. And I think that's also a really important thing right now to be thinking about.
We have a few more questions. Someone witnessed trout jumping out of the water, the Potomac River Delta. There were roughly 10 of them, and are wondering why they were behaving like that.
So where are we talking about in the Potomac?
At the river's delta?
Oh, well, I'm not sure about the particulars, but in general, what might be happening there is, you've got cold streams running into warm rivers, right? I mean, like I said, 30,000 years ago, when most recent, we had several rounds of glaciation, but the most recent glacier, 30,000 years ago, something like that refrigerated this entire landscape. So the rivers at that point were all cold. They were all connected. And we also had a mini ice age about, a measly 5,000 years ago, which had implications for all sorts of other aspects about this region. I mean, Native Americans were farming. There was, in the Potomac River, I should say, in Chesapeake Bay, there was intensive agriculture from Native Americans. There was all sorts of cultural development. But that mini ice age that hit, like 5,000-ish years ago, that affected agricultural production from Native Americans here. It also affected the cold water landscape. So, I just think, to hit one main point again, what we're looking at when we look at brook trout is deep evolutionary history. It should really give us just a little respect for how nature has worked for so many millions of years. They've been around, humans and Europeans, we've been here for it's a drop in the bucket. This should really give us some appreciation for, where we are.
Okay, thanks. We've got a couple more questions I'm going to try to get through before the end of the hour comes up. Where can I learn about the landscape features that may clue me into where groundwater resurfaces to decrease warm summer temps in the streams? Awesome.
Well, we have, I give you some light reading on this. Email me and I'll send you a bunch of papers. And I can try to summarize them too. We've got some statistical methods and some modeling work. We can make some predictions. And by the way, we can make those predictions based on the way the land is formed. So this is kind of neat. So if you think about the way that a stream is situated in a watershed, if it's a V shape versus a U shape, that has different implications for the way groundwater moves in. So we can basically use those landform features and the way that the valley is shaped to predict where in the stream we're going to see groundwater emerging. Those that works. Okay, so I can give you more information there, but the main thing, at the big scale is, are you in the Shenandoah Valley or are you not? Like in West Virginia, that is the main thing, right? Because we have karst, we have groundwater. We're living on top of a lake system, an underground lake system. We're all connected to these fundamental flow paths. These are, essentially submerged lakes that we're all living on. And so all of our drinking water wells are just straws in the same cup, okay? Hundreds of straws drinking from the same cup. We really are in it together. That's the first thing about groundwater. And then when we look at the rest of the state, it's a little more complicated because it's not karst, it's not limestone, but it's more shallow groundwater flow paths. So you're going to have, groundwater infiltrating in a mountainside here and then coming up in a stream there. And it's a little bit more, it's definitely more hard to predict outside of the Shenandoah Valley karst region. But we do have, some techniques we can make predictions. So I've got my email, follow up, please, if you want.
Okay, and 2 more questions. Have you seen impacts on trout from pipeline construction?
I haven't monitored that. I know it's a big concern, and I know that the courts have been following that closely. I'm glad to see that. It is a real concern, and the mechanisms, the biology is unambiguous, right? Siltation, fragmentation, these are direct effects for brook trout. We know that with high confidence.
And our final question, with such limited resources, if you had to choose, would you put more emphasis on forest restoration, conservation, or in-stream habitat work?
Good question. I think it comes down to forests. I mean, a big picture is it comes down to forests, but what do you actually do with that? I mean, I think the big challenges are what West Virginia sees right now, especially in the eastern part of the state with the development for pipeline infrastructure. I think that's a huge challenge. I think the national forests, honestly, are doing pretty well. I mean, look, there's also some news you may have picked up on in the Greenbrier district of the Monongahela with respect to another fish species we didn't talk about today called candy darter. Candy darter, an endangered species listed under the Endangered Species Act. Brook trout are not listed under the Endangered Species Act, but they're obviously a focus of conservation here. So, candy darter recently has been, the Forest Service is changing its management to respect habitat for these native fish species, and that's really important. But I think the forest is doing pretty well on the landscape. The challenges, of course, are all the zoning offices. Now, this is me speaking as an individual, right? This is not the perspective of my organization, but as an individual, I'll say, I think the challenges are working with the counties across the state, 55 zoning offices. Oh, no, actually, I take it back. A few counties have zoning, but the county development boards, that's where the real work is. And many people on the line know this. That's not new to any of you, but I have to say I respect it. And it's a challenge. And I think, brook trout are a part of the picture. It's an important part of our natural heritage. It's an important part of our economic and cultural well-being, right? So there's a lot to organize. Now, West Virginia, of course, it's the headwaters. It's the headwaters, and you all know this. And from a regional perspective, it's the headwaters. Now, there's been a lot of work on trying to protect the best of the best places, the birthplace of rivers movement. That's important. And, look, there may be other opportunities for that starting November of 2020. I don't know, but the rest of the West Virginia serves so much. We serve so much by the clean water that we provide to the Ohio River and to the points east in the Atlantic slope. And that's something that West Virginians can be really proud in. And, we've got work to do, as you all know, but, this is an important part of our heritage, and it's an important thing to be working on. So I do appreciate your time and interest today. You've got my contact information. Feel free to reach out. I'm at the Leetown Science Center at U.S. Geological Survey. Leetown Science Center, it's part of the Department of the Interior. And, I appreciate your time and attention, and I want to wish everybody good luck out there. I know it's a stressful time for many folks, kids out there trying to be creative, parents out there trying to be creative. Hang in there and keep doing good work.
Thank you. Thank
So,
you, Dr. Hitt, for providing such an informative and engaging presentation.
you bet.
We hope all of our viewers and listeners have learned from this discussion and are better equipped to talk about the impacts of climate change on brook trout. Please contact us at wbrivers.org or on our Facebook page, or give us a call if you want to find out more about how you can get involved in our climate campaign. So this is part of a series. Next week, we'll be meeting Dr. Omar Abdul Aziz, an associate professor of civil and environmental engineering at West Virginia University. He will discuss his work on climate impacts, increasing hurricanes and storms, and freshwater flooding in the coastal areas. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you again next week.
All right. See y'all.
Good.